I actually don't buy it. And I think that if you look back in history, that antitrust actions often create more innovation. You know, when telcos
Yes.
were broken up, you got the mobile industry coming in maybe 10, 20 years faster than it would have before. When Microsoft
Yep.
had to fight its big case, you had Google being born. So, A, I think that's a
Yep.
false argument. B, on tax, you know, it's interesting. Digital dividends are, which is almost like a paying out of digital wealth by states, is becoming a thing. California has legislation around this. And so in the same way that sovereign wealth funds, you know, in Wyoming or Alaska or Norway have to give people checks for mineral wealth, well, why should we not get checks for our digital wealth?
A few quick thoughts,
Yes.
because we're sort of running out of time. Rana Faruha, are these companies too big to fail? Is any government or the EU, whoever, willing to dismember them?
I think they are. I think that they are now. You know, what one thing that's interesting is you're seeing in the US anyway, on both sides of the aisle, a push now for different reasons. I mean, Democrats tend to be more concerned about privacy issues and about labor issues. Republicans are concerned about whether or not there's discrimination on content online. And in some of the sort of more libertarian parts of the party are concerned about competition. But either way, you see governors in red states taking these tech players on. You see economic nationalist Republicans being concerned about them. You see Democrats of all stripes being concerned. Same thing in Europe, even outside Europe, Australia, coming up with tough new rules, and even China, as you say, rethinking, well, how should this sector work? There's now just a real tailwind towards change. And that's important. And I think COVID has really been the final straw, the final thing that sped this all up, because we knew we were moving to major digital disruption in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Well, now it's happening overnight. And it's going to have a major impact on jobs because these companies tend to create fewer jobs relative to their market caps as big companies did in the future. So as they get bigger, they're not creating as many jobs. That's a crisis for the public sector. So I think that you are, in the next 5 years, I expect going to see some real action with teeth coming from legislators.
Yeah, that real action comes from something that Scott mentioned earlier, which is where are all the profits going? They're going to the top 7 or 6 or 5 companies. And what does that do politically? It means that the next 995 are very much more interested in regulation and antitrust and supporting the political movement because they would like to keep existing, to have a business, to continue to make profit. And they don't want all the profit in the economy to be taken by the top 5 firms. And so you can have a coalition between consumers who want competition and small and medium-sized and even very large companies that would like competition also when that competition means their own survival and thriving.
Fiona Scott Morton, though, one quick question. I mean, you've consulted with a couple of these companies. From the inside, how do you think they view all of this? Is there a reflexive, defensive kind of thing going on? Or is there a realization that perhaps the writing's on the wall, things are going to have to change?
I would say in general, when I talk to these large companies, they are very focused on their business and their technology and what they're going to roll out tomorrow and how marvelous they are. And they don't think about these broader public issues at all. It's just not something a manager wakes up and does every day. And so if you spend all day working on your product and you think your product is terrific, then that isn't a mindset in which it ever occurs to you that there could be a downside to what you're doing. It's kind of not on the radar.
Even though you're being summoned to Senate committee hearings and you're being slapped with fines and the EU's spending ages drawing up legislation.
Yes, I mean, the people who go to the Senate, remember, are perhaps one executive, and then there's a bunch of lawyers. But the lawyers in a high-tech firm, I think, are not important. They're not key people.
I would just place one caveat, which is that the CEOs and other top leaders are trying very hard to hide the traces when they are communicating about steps that they know are anti-competitive and could be illegal. You could see comments saying, let's not have a paper trail on this discussion and things like that. So I think that they're quite aware of where the red lines are. And it also shows that laws have impact and laws can change the behavior. And that's why regulation and enforcement are so important.
Well, I'm going to get a final thought from each of you, and I'm going to ask you to project into the future, which essentially, given what we've discussed, what might these companies look like in 5 years' time? Marita Shaka.
Well, I hope they will be less dominant, perhaps broken up, that there will be actual room for innovation, and that the public interest will have been prioritized by all the regulatory and legislative efforts going forward.
Scott Galloway, do you think that they will look very different? Will they be the same? Will they be dismembered?
We'll go from 4 companies to 7 or 8. Apple's likely the only one that will not be forced to or not voluntarily divest itself. One of the keys that came up here was we always tend to look at antitrust through the lens of a decision of whether they're bad people or not, and this is some sort of punishment. The people around the cigarette companies, the people around the oil companies weren't necessarily bad people. They were doing their job just as big tech is. They're pursuing earnings. And when it's raining money, your vision gets blurred around what is good or not good for broader society. The group that has failed here is the citizenry who has failed to elect officials that hold these companies to the same standards we've held every other company. We suffer from an idolatry of innovators, such that the public has decided they are not subject to the same rules as every other industry. You know, there are huge problems here, but it all stems back to one source. Our public has been fascinated with technology. It's decided that these individuals can be part-time CEOs, that they can insult cave divers or manipulate markets or have the wealth of entire swaths of America and not pay their taxes because we've decided there's a different set of rules for people we deem to be innovators. It's idolatry of innovators that has taken us to a bad place.
And do you think the public's changing its mind on that?
I think the worm has turned. I think the public has decided that if there's a greater likelihood that your teen is depressed, if it's more difficult to earn a living, if we have a tax base that is shrinking because the most profitable companies in history aren't paying their taxes, we've decided that enough is enough, that there are negative externalities, and the same law should be applied, the same scrutiny should be applied to these companies that have been applied to every other company, and the same economic challenges, stresses, and responsibilities that every household faces, much less every business faces. We're fed up.
Fiona Scott-Morton, I wonder if you agree with that, what influence that might have on what these companies look like in 5 years' time.
I think it's very important that public perception has turned. I think whenever you're trying to bring an antitrust case or bring a regulation, the sense that the people think that there's a problem is a very important baseline spot to start from. I think we will see some breakups. I think in particular, Google may have some pieces that are required to divest. I think we're going to see a lot more interoperability, lots more opening up of the interfaces of these companies to allow competition along the content dimension or a complementary service or an interconnecting service. Like I mentioned with Facebook earlier, maybe interoperability between social networks would reduce the network effects and let us all talk to each other. So I think the environment is going to look a lot different in the future.
Rana Faruha, what do you think these companies might look like in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I think that many of the ideas that have been mentioned, I would agree with. I think interoperability is going to be key, data portability, a lot less complication in terms of the rights and responsibilities of these companies. I mean, just try going on and reading a 16-page summary of how any of them are going to use your data. Good luck. You're just going to click the box and say, yes, no problem. But that's going to change. That's the onus to make it simple and understandable is going to be on them. I think you could see Google being regulated much more like a utility. I mean, search is sort of at this point like electricity. You know, you have to have it. I agree with Scott that AWS is probably going to be spun off, which will get rid of some of the conflict of interest within Amazon. And beyond that, I think that you're going to have a lot more algorithmic auditing, monitoring of these companies. It's similar to the financial sector. I mean, if you look, there's 9 financial sector regulators. There's not even one tech regulator. That's going to change.
Such an interesting thought and so many more questions to ask. But that is it for this week on The Real Story. Thanks to our guests, Rana Faruha, Professor Fiona M. Scott-Morton, Maricha Shaka and Professor Scott Galloway. And if you have any suggestions for future deep dive topics that you think we should cover in the programme, you can find me on Twitter. I'm @Rittler. But for this week, from me, Ritala Shah, and the whole team, that's The Real Story. Thank you so much for your company, not only this week, but throughout 2020, which I think it's safe to say has been a rather busy and difficult year for many of us. We're taking a couple of weeks off from now until the new year, but we'll be right back, taking a deep dive into some of the biggest and most important stories in the news in the first week of 2021. So whatever you are up to for the next few weeks, stay safe, and we'll see you in the new year.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're looking at how money has come to rule human values in this year's Reith Lectures.
In his final lecture, Mark Carney focuses on the pressing issue of climate change.
Society wants the climate crisis solved, but how do we channel the market in service of society?
Do the roots of our environmental emergency lie in a deeper crisis of values?
The Wreath Lectures, Wednesday at 10 GMT. And in an hour, the fifth floor with Ferenaka Midi.
Today, a bond as strong as blood. We find out about what are called milk siblings in the Islamic faith. Also, how one artist has brought to life the sights and sounds of the city of Istanbul on a map.
That's in an hour. The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 11 hours GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson. Nigerian officials say they believe all of the abducted schoolboys have been released.
The governor of neighboring Zamfara state, where they were rescued, said that no child, no boy was left behind, so all of them have been rescued.
Japan deploys the army as record-breaking snowfall blocks roads and isolates communities. An Islamist insurgency in Mozambique forces hundreds of thousands of people to flee. The UN warns of a humanitarian emergency.
The situation is really dire. These people are lacking all basic amenities.
This isn't happening.
An economic crisis culminating in nuclear conflict has left America in pieces.
Sony withdraws Cyberpunk, one of the biggest video game releases of the year, and is the star of Bethlehem making a return to the skies this Christmas. You're listening to the BBC World Service live from London.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. Hundreds of Nigerian schoolboys who were abducted by gunmen a week ago have arrived back in their home state, Katsina. They were taken by bus to a government building in the state capital. The boys appeared before television cameras, barefoot and clutching blankets. The governor of Katsina says all 344 of those who were kidnapped have been freed on Thursday. The Islamist group Boko Haram has said it carried out the mass abduction. Here's our correspondent in Abuja, Ishaq Khalid.
What the officials are saying is that Boko Haram was not behind this particular kidnapping. Criminal gangs who are looking for money abducted them, but the state government is saying that no ransom was paid, even though there are questions as to exactly what really convinced the kidnappers to free these boys. There are more questions at the moment than answer, but the fact is that they are already out. They are no more in captivity.
The former president of Burundi, Pierre Buyoya, has died in Paris after contracting coronavirus. He was 71. The former soldier governed Burundi for a total of 13 years, twice coming to power in coups. In October, Mr. Buyoya was sentenced in his absence to life in prison by Burundi's Supreme Court for involvement in the murder of his successor. The United Nations has warned of a worsening humanitarian crisis in northern Mozambique, where an Islamist insurgency in Cabo Delgado province has forced hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. Andrew Harding has more details.
On a visit to the province, Angèle Dikongo-Atanga from the UN's refugee agency warned that the situation was likely to deteriorate further. She blamed terrorism, but also spoke of local frustrations about inequality and the failure to share wealth generated by the region's vast mineral and gas reserves. Mozambique's neighbours are discussing possible military support, but there has also been growing criticism of the government's handling of the crisis amid allegations of human rights abuses and widespread corruption.
Sony has stopped selling one of the most highly anticipated video games of all time on its PlayStation consoles, just days after the title's release. Customers complained that Cyberpunk 2077 kept crashing and freezing. Here's Theo Leggett.
Cyberpunk 2077 was launched amid a wave of hype in mid-December. The game, which immerses players in a dystopian world, was developed by the Polish firm CD Projekt. It rapidly started to attract complaints, particularly from users with older gaming consoles who said it was prone to technical glitches. One reviewer also complained that the game had triggered an epileptic seizure. Sony Interactive Entertainment says it has now been removed from the PlayStation Store until further notice, and customers who've already bought it will be refunded.
News from the BBC. The authorities in Ethiopia have offered rewards of up to $250,000 for information leading to the arrest of leaders of the rebel Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. Arrest warrants have been issued for more than 60 senior members of the TPLF, which has been fighting the federal government since last month. The European Union's chief negotiator on a post-Brexit trade deal with Britain has said the moment of truth has arrived to see if an agreement can be reached. Michel Barnier told the European Parliament to be ready for all scenarios. Britain will leave the EU's single market and customs union on the 1st of January, and tariffs and quotas will be reimposed if there's no deal. Our Europe correspondent, Nick Bigg, was listening to Mr Barnier.
He also said that basically it's the British fault. It's the fault of the British. We're in this position because the UK side had an option back in the summer to extend the transition period, which they declined. And so he lamented the lack of time they've got to do a deal. And that's why he said the next hours, we're not talking about weeks or days anymore. He said the next hours are crucial.
The daughter of the dissident Iranian journalist Ruhollah Zam has tweeted details of the last conversation she had with him on the eve of his execution last week. Niaz Zam said she had a 5-minute conversation with her father in which he told her how much he loved her before saying goodbye. Ruhollah Zam had been convicted of fomenting violence during street protests in Iran and collaborating with foreign countries, charges he denied. Heavy snowfall is continuing to cause travel chaos in Japan. More than 600 vehicles remain stuck on a major road in Niigata Prefecture, almost 2 days after it became impassable. One driver said he'd been in his car for 40 hours, while another said he'd run out of supplies and was eating snow for sustenance. BBC News.
You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Ritson. The kidnapping of hundreds of boys from a secondary school in northwest Nigeria has made headlines across the world and reminded people of the heartbreaking kidnapping of the Chibok schoolgirls back in 2014. Now, more than 300 of the boys have arrived back in their home state of Katsina. The Islamist militant group Boko Haram, which had taken the Chibok girls, said it was responsible for the latest attack, while the authorities are sceptical. Abdulaziz Suleiman, who's a political activist in northern Nigeria, says the pattern of behaviour does point to Boko Haram rather than just local bandits.
What the officials are saying is that Boko Haram was not behind this particular kidnapping. Criminal gangs who are looking for money abducted them, but the state government is saying that no ransom was paid, even though there are questions as to exactly what really convinced the kidnappers to free these boys. There are more questions at the moment than answer, but the fact is that they are already out. They are no more in captivity.
For more, I spoke to our reporter in Abuja, Ishak Khalid.
On a visit to the province, Angèle Dikongo-Atanga from the UN's refugee was like...
The latest we have is that the boys, 344, have been taken to the Katsina State Government House. That is the governor's office in the city of Katsina, where they were briefed by the governor. He tried to pacify them, to reassure them. Also, they look so exhausted, they look so confused and bewildered. Many of them were barefooted after they were rescued there. So even though there are conflicting figures as to exactly how many children were kidnapped, these 344 have been rescued. And the governor of Katsina State, where the incident happened, and also the governor of neighboring Zamfara State, where they were rescued, said that no child, no boy was left behind. So all of them have been rescued. But there are still, of course, questions as to whether some have been, left behind or not, or some of the students escaped to rural areas where there are no communication lines so that their escape could be communicated to. So we are still waiting to find out exactly if the boys have been rescued, all of them, or they are still behind with the captors.
Yeah, because local officials saying that they've all been released, but this actually conflicts with a video that was released yesterday.
Exactly. Yesterday, Boko Haram issued a video showing the boys and claiming that it was holding them. That really raised a lot of fears. But the good news came just hours after that video. So there is some sense of confusion here. Many people say that Boko Haram was indeed involved in some way, but the release of these boys actually raised some doubt about that opinion. So the officials here are saying that Boko Haram was not behind the kidnapping, but some observers are saying perhaps the criminal gangs who kidnapped these boys, who normally operate in that area, kidnapping people for ransom, might have forged some sort of alliance with Boko Haram. If that's the case, then Boko Haram may be disappointed. But the good news is that these boys have been rescued. They have been freed. They are no longer with the captors. Their parents are happy and the entire country is happy. But there are still unanswered questions as to how they were kidnapped, how they were rescued, and what is now the aftermath of their rescue.
Ishaq Khalid in Abuja. After months of relative calm and low case numbers, residents in parts of Australia's biggest city have been urged to stay at home because of a cluster of coronavirus infections. Other states are imposing restrictions on travellers from Sydney's Northern Beaches region, where the new outbreak is centred. I asked our correspondent in Sydney, Phil Mercer, how many new cases were detected and how full the hospitals are.
Well, the authorities here in Sydney, Alex, are racing to identify the source of 28 infections. Now, those numbers might be relatively small compared to other countries, but in the Australian context, they are significant. Before Wednesday, Australia had recorded just one locally acquired coronavirus case in the past fortnight. So the authorities are extremely concerned about what's happening, and 250,000 residents in Sydney's Northern Beaches have been told to stay at home until at least Monday. And the authorities are saying that if this outbreak isn't contained, that further restrictions could be imposed over the Christmas period.
So the authorities concerned, but what are they actually doing, Phil?
There have been four main pillars to Australia's coronavirus strategy: mass testing, the closure of international borders to foreign travellers, very strict lockdowns, and also sophisticated contact tracing. And it's that last element that really is in the front line of this fight against this outbreak, this cluster here in Sydney. The authorities want to trace each and every source of infection. And here's the New South Wales Premier, Gladys Berejiklian.
Everybody in Greater Sydney needs to be on high alert. If you have the mildest of symptoms, please get tested and isolate. But also, can everybody please think about their activity? Nobody should be getting on public transport without wearing a mask. Nobody in Greater Sydney should be going to a supermarket, a place of worship, or other high-risk areas without wearing a mask. It will just be crazy if people are undertaking those activities without wearing a mask.
So that's the Premier of New South Wales. Phil, how does this affect Christmas?
Well, for many, many people on the Northern Beaches, they are advised to limit non-essential travel. People from other parts of Sydney and other parts of Australia have been urged not to visit the northern parts of Sydney's coastlines. So this is disrupting plans for many, many people. Then there's the broader issue of each and every state and territory here in Australia has imposed tough border controls on residents from the Northern Beaches of Sydney. Western Australia is reimposing restrictions on everyone from the state of New South Wales, of which Sydney is the state capital. So safe to say that this cluster of infections in Sydney has put the entire country on edge. Since the pandemic began, Australia has recorded about 28,000 coronavirus cases. More than 900 people have died. And this cluster in Sydney, Alex, is a very sharp reminder that here in Australia, the fight against the virus is far from over.
Record-breaking snowfall in parts of Japan has led to hundreds of cars being stranded and impassable roads. The army has been deployed to help, but more heavy weather is on the horizon, as Will Leonardo reports.
Japan's snow country, areas facing the Asian mainland across the Japan Sea, is accustomed to cold snaps, but the intensity of this weather pattern is causing disruption across a wide swathe of the country. Thousands of homes have lost power and several roads are blocked after some places experienced more than 2 meters of snowfall. On the Kaetsu Expressway in Niigata, hundreds of drivers have been stuck in their vehicles since Wednesday night. At one stage, more than 1,000 people were trapped as the snow accumulated around them. Those still there have another few hours to wait as officials say they hope to clear the expressway by Saturday. Similar scenes played out in mountainous Nagano prefecture. Members of the self-defense forces have been deployed to help. They've been handing out blankets, food and petrol. One driver told the national broadcaster that he'd been in his car for 40 hours. Another said he'd run out of supplies and was eating snow. The national government has promised help too, but with forecasters warning of as much as 80 centimetres more snow this weekend, the disruption looks set to continue.
Will Leonardo. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Jerry has the headlines.
More than 300 boys in northern Nigeria have arrived back in their home state a week after being kidnapped. Pierre Buyoya, the former president of Burundi, who twice came to power in coups, has died in France of COVID-19. And days after its release, Sony has removed a highly anticipated video game from its online PlayStation store following customer complaints.
Yes, the game is Cyberpunk 2077 and it offers a dark vision of Earth's future.
The year is 2077. An economic crisis culminating in nuclear conflict has left America in pieces.
Touted as a blockbuster, the game has now been called a disaster by critics. Peter Goffin has been following the story. Peter, what happened?
Well, Alex, the problem here was technical glitches. So players said that if you weren't playing on the newest version of PlayStation, that's the PlayStation 5, which came out this month, the screen would be choppy, the game was prone to crashing. One reviewer with epilepsy said a part of the normal gameplay triggered a seizure, and bizarre things would go wrong with the animation too. So for instance, some people say when they're driving a car in the game, their character appears to be sticking out of the car's roof with his arms out, naked from the waist down, which is very funny if you haven't just spent $60 on a game that you've heard for years will be a masterpiece. Because the Polish games designer behind this game, CD Projekt Red, has been working on Cyberpunk since 2012. And it's got an action-packed story, a sprawling landscape to explore, it's got stunning graphics, it even has the Hollywood star Keanu Reeves voicing a character who looks exactly like Keanu Reeves. So if you think of this game in terms of Hollywood, it's like the latest Star Wars or Marvel film was released, it didn't play properly, and it had to be pulled out of cinemas on opening weekend. And keep in mind, video game fans were already upset at the company because the game release was delayed by months, in part because of COVID. Now here's one of Cyberpunk's developers, Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz, speaking of the trouble they've had so far.
We try not to take in too much of the negative comments when they arrive. And of course, there are also situations which never can be really accepted, like some kind of threats and situations like those, which also happened, unfortunately.
So lots of anger, and presumably this is a disaster for the company's financial position.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. Now, shares for the company CD Projekt Red have already fallen by 40% on the Warsaw Stock Exchange since the game was released. Some 8 million people had pre-ordered the game, but the company is now offering them refunds. And now they've also promised that fixes to the game will be available for download in the new year, but at one point industry experts said Cyberpunk 2077 would sell 30 million copies over the next 2 years, and that now seriously seems at risk. And keep in mind the video game industry is big money, and it has been for a long time, but with COVID-19 and lockdowns and people staying home more, it's expected to take in more than $150 billion in revenue this year alone. And by comparison, the film industry took in less than a third of that at cinemas worldwide in 2019, and that was their all-time box office revenue record. So a lot is at stake in the video gaming industry.
Yeah, the word whoops rather springs to mind. Peter, thank you. Peter Goffin. Corruption is not unusual in Kenya, but this case seems particularly galling. The governor of Nairobi, Mike Sonko, was said to have appropriated funds intended for underprivileged children, and also paid for his daughter's trip to New York out of the public purse. He's now been sacked after being impeached by the Senate. Emmanuel Igunza reports from Nairobi.
Mike Sonko was accused of, among other things, using public monies to fund his daughter's trip to New York in 2018 and the misuse of millions of shillings meant for bursaries for underprivileged children in Nairobi. Mr. Sonko, known for his flashy lifestyle and love of gold jewelry, denied the charges, claiming he was a victim of corrupt cartels in Nairobi. The ousted governor is no stranger to controversy. Prison authorities in Kenya recently accused him of escaping from a maximum facility 20 years ago. Last December, he was arrested on suspicion of corruption. He once included bottles of cognac as part of free COVID-19 sanitation kits distributed to Nairobians, claiming the alcohol content in the drink could stop coronavirus. Residents of Nairobi will now have to go for a by-election in 60 days as Mr. Sonko has no serving deputy. He becomes only the second sitting governor to be impeached after Kiambu County's Ferdinand Waititu was removed from office in January, facing similar charges.
Emmanuel Igunza. The United Nations is warning that the number of people fleeing violence in northern Mozambique has risen fourfold this year to 420,000, and that the humanitarian crisis is likely to get worse. An Islamist insurgency, which began 3 years ago with militants carrying out massacres in villages across Cabo Delgado province, has spread and intensified. A senior official from the United Nations Refugee Agency blamed terrorism, but also cited inequality and a perceived failure to share wealth from the region's vast mineral and gas reserves. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reports from Johannesburg.
A makeshift flotilla approaches the shore in northern Mozambique. On board, dozens of families fleeing from a surging conflict. They burned everything, said this fisherman. I only have my boat left. He and his family have come ashore at the port city of Pemba, safe for now. But the war here is spreading fast. The fisherman's wife, Aziza Falume, gave birth to a daughter during their escape. She's named her Suffering. I'm still afraid, she says. I don't know if the enemy will follow us here. That enemy is an Islamist insurgent group seeking to introduce Sharia law. It's been blamed for a series of massacres and atrocities across the northern province of Cabo Delgado. 64-year-old Muanasa Amulia describes how the insurgents attacked them in a field, beheading one man, killing another, and abducting her own granddaughters. The result? Well over 400,000 civilians have now fled their homes, many living in makeshift camps.
The situation is really dire. These people are lacking all basic amenities.
On a visit to Pemba, Angèle Dikongwe Atanga from the UN's Refugee Agency warned that the situation was likely to deteriorate further.
The figures are growing as they go by. And therefore, we, the international community, really need to quickly ramp up our capacity before it gets out of hand.
Perante as investidas terroristas, o governo
Mozambique's government has blamed foreign extremists. President Filipe Nyusi saying that Mozambique was taking actions to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But many people now say the roots of the conflict lie closer to home, in corruption and inequality. A promotional video for a giant new gas refinery. The province has seen billions of dollars of foreign investment in mines and offshore projects, but many locals complain they've been pushed off their land and see no benefits. The UN's Angèle Dikongwe Atanga again.
If I were also from a place like this one, which is endowed with a lot of wealth, and I see that that wealth is being exploited, is being used, and I don't see the shares of that wealth, I would also be disgruntled. I would not be happy. If they have no choice, they have no hope, they have no dreams, then We, international community, should not be watching such situations idly.
As more families arrive in Pemba, there is talk of foreign military intervention, and not just by private security firms. Mozambique's neighbours fear a conflict that increasingly resembles the crisis in northern Nigeria is poised to spread.
A powerful cyclone with 340-kilometre-an-hour winds has caused extensive damage to homes, crops and infrastructure in Fiji. Genevieve Giva is from the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network and is based in the capital, Suva. She gave us the latest.
Cyclone Yasa is now Category 3 and moving through the Lau group, so it still hasn't completely left us. The communities that were affected yesterday overnight, particularly in the north, have faced devastation. The National Disaster Management Office confirming over 93,000 people affected and 2 fatalities. And so now we are trying to mobilize and recover and rebuild. We're seeing extensive damage to homes, to communities losing their agriculture and livelihood from the cyclone. Damage to our electricity and water supplies. And so we are seeing over 24,000 people sheltering in 456 evacuation centers as we try to mobilize with youth groups and civil society on the ground to see what is needed and how we can help. I think people are still very much on alert and of what can happen and is to come. And Cyclone Yasa is going to continue to move through the group until tomorrow.
Now, Jerry has some other stories from our news desk.
President Jair Bolsonaro has criticised a decision by Brazil's Supreme Court to make vaccination against COVID-19 compulsory. The court ruled that Brazilians could be required by the authorities to be inoculated against coronavirus, as is the case with several other vaccines. Mr. Bolsonaro insists he won't be vaccinated. The president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has said he's ready to hold talks with the US President-elect Joe Biden on any subject, but he would not betray the country's socialist ideals. He was addressing Parliament exactly 6 years after his predecessor, Raul Castro, and former US President Barack Obama announced moves to normalise ties. And here in Britain, the Professional Footballers Association says players are overwhelmingly in support of continuing to take a knee to highlight racial inequality and fight discrimination. The Players' Union consulted members on whether they wanted to continue the gesture after some fans booed it.
Jerry, thank you. We may be about to see our own star of wonder in the next few days as Jupiter and Saturn come into close alignment. The Vatican believes 2,000 years ago it was that sort of alignment that created the unusually bright star reported as the Star of Bethlehem. Dr. Carolyn Crawford from the Institute of Astrology at Cambridge University spoke to my colleague Michelle Hussein.
What we're seeing here is when 2 planets appear to just line up very close together in the sky. And it's unusual for Jupiter and Saturn to be coming so close to each other. They're getting closer and closer together each night, and they make their closest approach on the 21st of December. And it's very easy to see, any time in the next week. You just need to look to the southwest horizon, fairly low down. So ideally, you want a sort of clear view to the horizon. And for about an hour after sunset, it's very easy to see Jupiter because it just looks like a very bright star relatively low down. But Saturn is just a short way off at about 11 o'clock from Jupiter. I mean, they're not going to line up exactly. They'll still be separated. But if you look at them through binoculars, and that's a very good way to check that you're actually looking at the right thing, you'll be able to see perhaps the rings around Saturn and some of the 4 big moons of Jupiter, which will look like little stars to either side of Jupiter along the line of direction joining Jupiter and Saturn.
But how often has this happened in the past? And do we have any idea whether it did happen 2,000 years ago? Because you can imagine that with the naked eye, it might well look like a single bright light in the sky.
Of course, and you have to remember that, 2,000 years ago, people were a lot more aware of what was happening in the skies than we are today. And they certainly tracked the movements of all the planets as far out as Saturn. And the coming of two of them together in the sky probably had a much greater significance than we hold today. It's not impossible that the Star of Bethlehem was in a planetary alignment like this. Another contender is that perhaps Venus and Jupiter, there's another alignment that would have happened in 2 BC, and that would have been very bright as well. So these kind of alignments happen fairly often. I mean, it's not that unusual. It's comparatively rare for them, Jupiter and Saturn, to come this close. And this particular sort of closeness happening at a time when we could actually see it so clearly, it happened probably about 800 years ago. And it won't happen again to 2080. So, you might consider it a sort of once-in-a-lifetime occurrence if you're lucky.
Dr. Carolyn Crawford from the University of Cambridge, ending this edition of the Newsroom. Thanks for listening.
Now on the BBC World Service, today's BBC Minute update on the coronavirus.
It's William and Laura.
A second coronavirus vaccine is nearing emergency approval in the United States after it was endorsed by a panel of experts. Moderna's COVID vaccine could be shipped as soon as this weekend.
Meanwhile, in Brazil, the Supreme Court has ruled that the government can make getting vaccinated against coronavirus mandatory. That's already the case with several other vaccines. People who refuse could be banned from certain public activities and spaces.
Away from vaccines, scientists in Singapore have found that babies born to women with COVID-19 have antibodies against the coronavirus, but the researchers say it's not yet clear what level of protection this may offer newborns.
New numbers show the impact of the pandemic on tourism. The United Nations says countries welcomed 900 million fewer international visitors in the past year. Visitor numbers are their lowest in 30 years.
And here's a tip to keep yourself safe at holiday gatherings. Don't play board games where everyone is touching a dice or cards and potentially spreading germs. BBC Minute.
You're with the BBC World Service. On today's Science in Action, we're asking whether the new strain of COVID identified this week spreads faster or evades vaccines.
The escape from antibodies and potentially vaccines is the thing we need to look out for. And it certainly isn't happening now. I don't believe that this new variant is resistant to any vaccine-induced responses. The question is whether the virus is on its way to becoming less sensitive to the vaccines in the longer term.
More detailed analysis after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Hundreds of Nigerian schoolboys who were abducted a week ago have arrived back in their home state, Katsina. They were taken by bus to a government building in the state capital. The boys appeared before television cameras, barefoot and clutching blankets. They were freed in neighbouring Zamfara state on Thursday. The circumstances of their release remain unclear. The former president of Burundi, Pierre Buyoya, has died in Paris after contracting the coronavirus. He was 71. Mr. Buyoya was recently sentenced in his absence to life in prison for the murder of his successor, Melchior Ndadaye. Reports coming in from Afghanistan say at least 15 people have been killed by an explosion at a religious ceremony. The Interior Ministry said the blast took place in a village in Ghazni province. The UN has warned of a worsening humanitarian crisis in northern Mozambique, where an Islamist insurgency has forced more than 400,000 people from their homes. During a visit to Cabo Delgado, a senior UN official blamed terrorism, but she also referred to inequality in the region. Sony has removed one of the most eagerly anticipated video games of the year from its PlayStation Store, days after its release. Customers complained that Cyberpunk 2077 was riddled with technical glitches. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator says the moment of truth has arrived if a deal is to be struck before transition period expires at the end of the year. Michel Barnier told the European Parliament he couldn't predict whether there would be a deal. Heavy snowfall is continuing to cause travel chaos in Japan. Hundreds of vehicles remain stuck on a main road in Niigata Prefecture. One driver said he was trapped for 40 hours. BBC News.
Welcome to Science in Action from the BBC World Service with me, Roland Pease. Later in the programme, we will be meeting the scientist who studies birds because she thinks we are brilliant.
If you look at humans, then there are so many amazing things we're doing, right? We are building skyscrapers, we have crazy wars, now we have this coronavirus where we are inventing vaccines, whatever, right? So there are many things where you think, wow. Why are we so intelligent and how did our intelligence evolve?
Think groupthink. Also, life rebounds after the dinosaur-destroying meteor impact, revealed by More Than Bones.
And we also find, enticingly, what we call coprolites, but that's actually, just to put it bluntly, fossil poop, and a lot of it. So it's a very rich environment that colonized the crater after the impact.
Poop-tastic. It was an unusual moment even for this COVID year when the UK Health Secretary stood up in Parliament to talk not about policy, but briefly, rather, a little biology.
Over the last few days, thanks to our world-class genomic capability in the UK, we have identified a new variant of coronavirus which may be associated with the faster spread in the southeast of England. Initial analysis suggests that this variant is growing faster than the existing variants. We've currently identified over 1,000 cases with this variant, predominantly in the south of England, although cases have been identified in nearly 60 different local authority areas, and numbers are increasing rapidly. Similar variants have been identified in other countries over the last few months.
And that was it. No more information about the new strain, no details on what is known about its spread. We have been here before with SARS-CoV-2 mutations. Several times on Science in Action, we've discussed a mutation called D614G, which developed and spread quickly a month or two after the original coronavirus first emerged in China. Although lab experiments suggested it is more dynamic, it's not clear that the mutation has made any difference in terms of the speed of spread or severity of the disease in people and communities. So, what to make of this new strain we've just heard about? Fortunately, Cambridge virologist Ravi Gupta has been working closely with the government scientists, and he published his own analysis of the mutations just a few hours after that parliamentary announcement.
The thing that's of concern is that the strain is there and it is spreading. It's very difficult to understand whether the transmission rate of this new variant is any different than what you'd expect. But the worrying thing is not that it's transmitting, because you'd expect that, but that actually it's carrying a number of mutations, the significance of which we are still unclear of.
I suppose I was slightly wary, shall we say, of this announcement, because we've spoken many, many times on this programme about another mutation, the one that's called D614G, that appears to have arisen from Spain and appears to have spread very quickly. But in fact, the virus itself doesn't seem to behave very differently, even though it appears to be the one that's now prevalent.
I mean, yes, I strongly believe that actually D614G is a higher replication rate virus, and that's been shown in many, many studies now. And the only explanation for seeing this virus take over in every country in the world is that it was outcompeting the original strain.
And this new variant that the Health Secretary was talking about in Parliament, is that a variant further to that D614G variant that we were already talking about?
That's right. Now, in my lab, we call D614G the new wild type because it's everywhere, the vastly dominant strain worldwide. So it's an incredible thing that's happened in such a short space of time. So yes, the things we're hearing about are on top of a mutation that had already happened.
And that one is one that affects the spike protein, which is the part of the virus that binds onto our cells. As I understand it, this new strain has got several additional mutations accumulated, but they're quite hard to keep track of and to know what's significant and what isn't.
The strain that they're talking about actually is based on a group of viruses that had acquired a single mutation in a key area of the protein that binds to the receptor, the cellular receptor, and it's called the receptor binding domain. That virus has expanded quite significantly in the UK and Europe in the last few months, and that was the background on which a group of other mutations arose.
These mutations, these are just changes in the RNA code, which then affect the character, the chemical character of the spike protein, which then could affect the way it binds. Are these all doing things which are having or could have an effect on the way that the virus and our cells interact?
I don't think that all of them will have an impact. So we think that many of these mutations have arisen due to antibody pressure. The virus is either trying to make itself replicate faster, which is what we saw with 614G, The second option is immune escape. And we think that certainly the mutations in the receptor binding domain, such as the 501 I mentioned, are likely to be escape mechanisms from the immune system, but they could also have a dual function of increasing the virus attachment to target cells.
So when you say escape from the immune system, that means that if I get infected by the virus, I raise in my body antibodies to the virus, to the spike protein. By making these small changes, it means that my immune antibodies don't work so well.
We sometimes refer to it as an arms race. The virus changes, then the host changes, and then the virus changes again, and that's how viruses have evolved typically through their history. So this is to be expected. Of course, the concern is that we're designing vaccines and therapeutics against this protein, which appears to tolerate multiple mutations, as it were, and therefore we're concerned that, of course, these mutations might compromise the efficacy of some of the things we're designing in the longer term.
I presume that if I have an infection and that virus mutates, then my immune system will try to keep up with it, and even then the mutated forms may still be somewhat susceptible, but not so susceptible. I don't know quite how black and white it all is.
Yes, it's not black and white because, of course, we develop a whole array of responses to viruses, and we develop different types of antibodies targeting different parts of the spike protein, and therefore these escape mutations will have impacts maybe on individual antibody types, but of course we now have a combination of at least 5 mutations, so you could be knocking out 5 different parts of the immune response. Although the impact may be incremental, you don't know which individuals have which antibody responses.
I guess that then raises 2 questions for the near future. One of which is whether if a virus which can escape the immune system better will then lead to worse health outcomes, and secondly, whether it will become more transmissible from one person to another.
I think that the more concerning thing is that the escape from antibodies and potentially vaccines is the thing we need to look out for. And it certainly isn't happening now. I don't believe that this new variant is resistant to any vaccine-induced responses. Currently, the vaccines will work because vaccines elicit very, very broad responses and multiple different types of antibodies. The question is whether the virus is on its way to becoming less sensitive to the vaccines in the longer term.
A disturbing thought, and clearly there will be a host of lab experiments testing the effects of these accumulating mutations, as well as epidemiological watchfulness. Thanks to Ravi Gupta of Cambridge University, his paper was posted on the bioRxiv website. Complicated dynamic interactions between the immune system and the virus also probably underlie many of the clinical complications of COVID-19, organ failure and so on, as well as the debilitating long COVID that many recovered patients experience. We learned a lot more about these this week thanks to an assay developed at Yale University which can fish out from blood samples not only the virus-attacking antibodies Ravi was just talking about, but also rogue autoantibodies which can attack our own tissues. It turns out, according to immunologist Akiko Iwasaki, COVID patients have a lot of these.
Of the nearly 3,000 target that we were testing, about 120 targets were identified to be specifically bound by these autoantibodies in COVID patients. Some patients would have just 1 or 2 targets that they react to, and in some cases there were dozens. So it really was remarkable to us that, such high levels of autoantibodies are being generated.
What sort of things would these autoantibodies do if they're attaching to a target that's part of your natural proteome, part of your natural protein ecosystem? Presumably that's then going to start disrupting things that your body should be doing, which might include, heart tissue or something like that.
Exactly right. So there are different kinds of autoantibodies that appear to affect our immune response to the virus, as well as sort of damaging antibodies that might bind to molecules that are in the brain, or kidney, blood vessels, and so on.
So these are malfunctioning immune antibodies that are disrupting the immune system.
That's correct. We call them the friendly fire because these antibodies are actually attacking the very cells that are trying to control the virus infection, such as cytokines, and even T cells and B cells are being targeted by this friendly fire antibodies that would obviously interfere with our ability to tackle viral infections.
I mean, would that give some explanation then why the virus can be very serious for some people, but others manage to tackle it well? It might be that somehow this messing around with the immune system might be part of the virus's defense mechanism.
Yeah, it's possible that it's a virus that, intends to do this to evade our immune control and replicate better. In other cases, it's the overt immune response itself that's causing this kind of friendly fire to become initiated because of this highly inflammatory environment that the immune system creates for itself. So exact mechanism of why these antibodies are generated is still unknown. These antibodies will clearly interfere with our both innate and adaptive immune response against the virus.
Well, I was wondering how well the kinds of molecular details you're seeing correlate with the things that the clinicians are telling us about the disease.
We are seeing, for instance, people who have autoantibody to brain antigens have some impairment in their cognitive functions, and we're really looking into the specific relationship between the autoantibody and the disease of that tissue.
Is this something that somehow triggered that these are antibodies that none of us would have had at all in the first place? I'm very puzzled.
Actually, it turns out that there are two types of autoantibodies we found. Ones that seem to have pre-existed prior to COVID, because we find these high levels of autoantibodies to certain molecules at the very first sampling, which is a little too early to develop these types of antibodies as a result of infection. So those pre-existing antibodies include antibodies to type 1 interferons, which are key antiviral cytokines that control the viral replication.
I think of them as kinds of messenger molecules.
Right, these are sort of alarm signals that the immune cells send out in order to control the virus infection. And some people have pre-existing antibodies to these interferons.
The other thing is, we've talked several times on the program about long COVID, which are these symptoms of exhaustion, of puzzlement, all kinds of issues that people have long after they've recovered from the main disease. Are these autoimmune responses likely to be involved in that?
Fortunately, we are now starting, as of this week, to really dig into the blood samples from long COVID patients to be able to analyze whether they also might have autoantibodies, and if so, what type, and whether we can interfere with that process of damage created by such autoantibodies.
And Akiko Iwasaki said afterwards, knowing about these autoantibodies should improve clinicians' prospects for therapies to offset their impact. Akiko's paper was also, like Ravi's, posted as a preprint at the medRxiv website. Every now and again I pause and wonder how our species has the intelligence to comprehend such things as viruses, immunity, or the forces that shape the universe. Evolution only needed to make sure that we could feed ourselves and avoid being eaten. The idea that the complexity of living in social groups was the driver has been bolstered by a series of experiments on a completely unrelated species, ravens. Experiments, according to Simone Pica, based on the way scientists have previously studied intelligence in infants and chimpanzees.
A physical task would be this game, what we quite often see on the streets, where people hide a money coin under a cup, and the person has 2 cups or 3 cups, right? And then you try to be quick and see where the coin under the cup is moving, right? So
as they switch them around, you're trying to keep track of them.
Yeah, keeping track of them. And so here, this is something similarly we can do with the ravens. Can they track a hidden object which they've seen being placed under a cup? So this is, for instance, a physical cognitive task. A social cognitive task would be I'm also hiding a reward under 1 of 2 cups. And then me, as the social partner, the human experimenter, I'm giving a cue. So for instance, I look at the cup or I point with my finger to the cup. So this provides insight in whether they can understand gaze or a gesture.
And you had a whole host of experiments of this kind of character.
Yeah.
And you were working with 8 ravens, is that right?
Yeah, so we hand raised 10. It's a huge thing to hand raise them. So hand raising, this is first this cute thing where they are in their nests and you just have to feed them very often. And the harder part is more that, of course, you want that they really like to work with you in these experiments, that they have fun, that they trust you. So they are learning their names, and then you also separate them from their friends, from their conspecifics, because if you do an experiment, it's just you working with this raven.
These experiments are similar to the ones that people do with great apes.
Yeah.
I mean, are you seeing some kind of equivalence in the performance in these experiments as people know with great apes?
But of course it's different because here we have animals who have a beak, they don't have hands, they are much smaller. Their vision is very different from great apes, so in a way we had to adapt our test battery a little bit. But then overall, all the tasks we did, we found that actually the performance of the ravens is very similar compared to the results on the great apes. And I think that's very interesting because our ravens, they were very young. We tested them. We were also interested in the development of cognitive skills. So we tested them at 4 different time points, 4 months, 8, 12, and 16 months of age. And in a way, we had expected that maybe at 4 months of age, their cognition is not yet fully formed, right? So, but then over this time course, they get better and better in the test battery. But that wasn't the case. Actually, their performance was very similar already at the age of 4 and 16 months. So in a way, it didn't get better. So we are concluding here that their cognitive skills are already fully developed. And then if you think, wow, you have a raven only 4 months, and then the performance in the task compares to what adult great apes are doing. I think that's really interesting.
The fact that humans and great apes, both social animals, both primates, both part of the same evolutionary tree, are doing these things, I guess we've learned that that's not so surprising. It's instructive, but not surprising.
Yeah.
Is it important to you, the fact that these are birds?
If you look at humans, then there are so many amazing things we're doing, right? I always say, okay, we are building skyscrapers, we have crazy wars, now we have this coronavirus where suddenly we all take action to take care of weaker animals. We are inventing vaccines, whatever, right? So there are many things where you think, wow, this is this one species on the planet which is really doing crazy intelligent stuff, or quite often also very dumb stuff, okay, I have to admit. But then it's like, why is there only a single species? So if we think about evolution, then you would think this should be more widespread and many more species maybe doing similar stuff. So the question is always, why are we so intelligent and how did our intelligence evolve? And so therefore we are always interested in what are precursors to this intelligence. And this is why we look at great apes, but then you look around in the animal kingdom and suddenly you have these crows sitting on the traffic lights and they're throwing down nuts and they wait. And they only do it then when the traffic light is green, so the cars are cracking the nuts. And suddenly there are so many behaviors around you in other species where it's like, wow, these animals, they are also so smart, right? And then you think, okay, what was maybe the common factor? And in non-human primates, we can always look back, homology, and maybe these abilities were already present in a shared ancestor. And this is why also other great apes do very smart things. But then you see these birds and they live maybe in different environments and they have to solve other problems and their brains are smaller and the organization of the brains is different. But then probably there must have been a factor which is maybe different, similar to why we evolved distinct cognitive skills, right? So for instance, ravens, they also live in this very complex social world. So they are leaving their parents and then they can live for around 9 years in these non-breeder aggregations. And of course there they have to They have to survive. They have to fight against competitors. There's a rank hierarchy. They want to find a mate, and so there are many tasks they have to solve, and so it's important that they are quite smart because they have to maneuver through this world. So it's important that they, over evolutionary time, became smarter. And by looking at other non-related species, then maybe we can pinpoint factors which were also important that humans became so smart.
Fascinating stuff from the behavioural scientist Simone Pica at the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology. There's an exhaustive description of the work in Science Reports. Finally, a story of redemption. The day a massive meteorite smacked into the Gulf of Mexico 66 million years ago may have been the last day of the dinosaurs, but it was also the first day of the rest of the history of life on Earth. Earthquakes may have broken mountains, tsunamis may have washed away coastlines, not to mention the rain of molten rock or the darkness of a nuclear winter created by lofted dust. But, it turns out, the best place to be right after the cataclysm was at ground zero, inside the crater carved out by the impact. I've been talking to two of the geologists, David Kring and Tim Breilauer, who have been finding evidence of the return of life amidst the debris that filled the hollow the day after that day of terror.
66 million years ago, a large asteroid, maybe 14, 15 kilometers in diameter, struck the Yucatan Peninsula, excavating a crater about 180 kilometers in diameter.
David Kring helped discover it.
Most people are aware of that event because it extinguished dinosaurs and most life on Earth at that time.
An almost iconic hammering that brought death and destruction to the whole globe. In the Gulf of Mexico, where the asteroid struck, the reverberations persisted.
The way I like to describe this is you have this like bathtub of water. It's shaking violently. And these waves are coming in and out of this bathtub. Major tsunamis, 30 meters high or even larger.
Marine geologist Tim Breilauer has seen the evidence of this violent cataclysm in the rocks and sediment drilled up from beneath the deep waters where the giant crater was forged. From the start, red tide algae were carried back into the crater by the violent currents. Tim can see their traces in his samples. But it was only months later that the sloshing waters stilled and new life bloomed.
After that, we have what we call the settling interval, where rocks are just laid down by subsiding energy from the seiche waves, these internal waves in the crater. And this layer is where life really returns back. So in this layer, we find rich evidence for life, including cyanobacteria, small crustaceans, minute fish. They look like fish larvae. And we also find, enticingly, what we call coprolites, but that's actually, just to put it bluntly, fossil poop, and a lot of it. So it's a very rich environment that colonized the crater after the impact.
The abundance, it seems, was no coincidence. As well as excavating a 2-kilometre deep hole in the ocean floor, the impact pulverised and melted the oceanic crust beneath, creating the biggest jacuzzi ever seen.
The hydrothermal system started at very high temperatures, over 300 degrees, and so the system would have initially been sterile. But as time progressed, that hydrothermal system cooled down, basically because this big body, 3-kilometer thick body of magma next door was itself cooling and solidifying.
And the speculation is that it's the heat from the hydrothermal system, the environment warm enough to sustain life, because elsewhere around the world, we had a nuclear winter. It was really hard for life to survive on land and in other parts of the ocean after the impact. So that's the speculation here, is that during this nuclear winter, the crater stayed warm because of this hydrothermal system.
It has to be said, spotting the traces of life in these once roiling rocks is a bit of a detective's task.
We don't see the fossil microbes themselves, but when those microbes were feeding on sulfate, they precipitated or produced sulfide, and in particular, the mineral pyrite.
Fool's gold.
Fool's gold, exactly.
Little raspberry nuggets or framboids of the stuff littered through the deposits and carrying the chemical signature it had once passed through living microbes. The idea of this vast, chemically sustained subterranean ecosystem is in itself intriguing. But for David Kring, the lessons concern the earliest eon of geological history, when the Earth was constantly battered by giant asteroids.
Chicxulub is a proxy, a small proxy, for the types of impact craters that were produced during the Hadean roughly 4 billion years ago. At that time, there were over 6,000 Chicxulub-sized craters or larger. In fact, there were about 200 impact basins, 1,000 to 5,000 kilometers in diameter. And we've suggested that those large impact events during the Hadean hosted similar hydrothermal systems, which would have been crucibles for the early evolution of life at that time.
An uplifting story of resilience, maybe what we need after a year coping with coronavirus. Well, I've been listening back to some of the editions of Science in Action from the beginning of the pandemic, and in many ways, it's astonishing how similar the basics of the story remain today, even though we have learned huge amounts along the way. I'll be looking at some of the key lessons next week, but until then, from me, Roland Pease, and producer Julian Siddall, and the rest of the crew at the BBC, stay well.
This is the BBC World Service. What can a body reveal about a person's life?
Beethoven, the composer of some of the world's most famous pieces of music. After his death in 1827, his autopsy revealed he was suffering from numerous ailments. I'm Georgia Mann, exploring how Beethoven's illnesses became a part of his music.
Dissecting Beethoven. Sunday at 14 GMT. And in an hour, the newsroom with Alex Ritson.
Nigerian officials say they believe all of the abducted schoolboys have been released. Australia's biggest city faces a major surge in COVID cases, and Sony withdraws Cyberpunk 2077, one of the biggest video game releases of the year.
The Fifth Floor is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
And coming up on today's Fifth Floor, we find out about the
to do what you want to do, choking off competitors, harming democracy or people's mental well-being, the environment. There are so many more concerns that I think need to be addressed. And another aspect to do that would be to tax these companies. And I really wonder whether in the United States, the aversion to talking about taxation of the tech giants will change after the economic fallout of the pandemic will put more pressure on the public purse. And so I think in understanding what can be done to balance out the outsized power of these big companies, we shouldn't only think about specific regulation of the technology or of the sector like artificial intelligence or social media companies, but rather also look at notions of taxing, of liability, of meaningful access to information. There are so many more horizontal legislative initiatives or regulatory initiatives that could actually lead to a balancing out of their outsized power.
Can I actually jump in on that?
Rana Faruha?
I actually would go further and say that, the research shows that innovation tends to happen in smaller firms. It tends to happen before companies go public. So this whole notion that just because we've got all the data, we are the big innovators, I actually don't buy it. And I think that if you look back in history, that antitrust actions often create more innovation. When telcos were broken up, you got the mobile industry coming in maybe 10, 20 years faster than it would have before. When Microsoft had to fight its big case, you had Google being born. So A, I think that's a false argument. B, on tax, it's interesting. Digital dividends which is almost like a paying out of digital wealth by states, states is becoming a thing. California has legislation around this. And so in the same way that sovereign wealth funds, in Wyoming or Alaska or Norway have to give people checks for mineral wealth, well, why should we not get checks for our digital wealth?
A few quick thoughts, because we're sort of running out of time. Rana Faruha, are these companies too big to fail? Is any government or the EU, whoever, willing to dismember them?
I think they are. I think that they are now. One thing that's interesting is you're seeing in the U.S. anyway, on both sides of the aisle, a push now for different reasons. I mean, Democrats tend to be more concerned about privacy issues and about labor issues. Republicans are concerned about whether or not there's discrimination on content online. And in some of the sort of more libertarian parts of the party are concerned about competition. But either way, you see governors in red states taking these tech players on. You see economic nationalist Republicans being concerned about them. You see Democrats of all stripes being concerned. Same thing in Europe, even outside Europe, Australia, coming up with tough new rules, and even China, as you say, rethinking, well, how should this sector work? There's now just a real tailwind towards change. And that's important. And I think COVID has really been the final straw, the final thing that sped this all up, because we knew we were moving to major digital disruption in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Well, now it's happening overnight. And it's going to have a major impact on jobs because these companies tend to create fewer jobs relative to their market caps as big companies did in the future. So as they get bigger, they're not creating as many jobs. That's a crisis for the public sector. So I think that you are, in the next 5 years, I expect going to see some real action with teeth coming from legislators.
Yeah, that real action comes from something that Scott mentioned earlier, which is where are all the profits going? They're going to the top 7 or 6 or 5 companies. And what does that do politically? It means that the next 995 are very much more interested in regulation and antitrust and supporting the political movement because they would like to keep existing, to have a business, to continue to make profit. And they don't want all the profit in the economy to be taken by the top 5 firms. And so you can have a coalition between consumers who want competition and small and medium-sized and even very
irrationality, a rise in hate speech, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, and other forms of discrimination.
The daughter of the dissident Iranian journalist Ruhul Azam has tweeted details of the last conversation she had with him on the eve of his execution last week. Niazam said she had a 5-minute call with her father in which he told her how much he loved her before saying goodbye. Ruhul Azam had been convicted of fomenting violence during street protests in Iran and collaborating with foreign countries, charges he denied. Heavy snowfall is continuing to cause travel chaos in Japan. More than 600 vehicles remain stuck on a major road in Niigata Prefecture almost 2 days after it became impassable. Members of the self-defense forces have been deployed to help. One driver said he'd been in his car for 40 hours. BBC News.
ንመደብ ፊፍስ ፍሎር ምስ ፈራናክ አሚዲ ኢኹም ትከታተሉ ዘለኹም ምሳና ጽንሑ
And thank you to Sfalam Araya of BBC Tigrinya for welcoming us back onto the 5th floor smoothly. Tigrinya, one of the BBC's 4 languages broadcasting to the Horn of Africa. And coming up in today's program, why a mosque and a Hindu temple are named after a 19th century court dancer in Punjab. Plus 9 months of working around COVID and counting. 9 months of working around COVID from our 5th floor colleagues on the joys of working from our 5th floor colleagues on the joys of working well differently. Margarita Rodriguez of BBC Mundo recently published an online story about what's called milk kinship or milk siblings in Islam. It refers to the relationship between children from different mothers who are breastfed by the same woman for a variety of reasons. Here's Margarita with more.
Everything started when, unfortunately, I couldn't breastfeed my daughter. But even being in that position, I realized how lucky I was because we had resources to buy formula milk, and many women have access to human milk banks for their babies thanks to donations of other mothers. So throughout human history, you realize how important other women have been in order to feed the children of mothers who, due to biological reasons or medical reasons, couldn't do it. So it was like a mix of an anthropological view, but also when you think of isolated communities, very poor communities where in the past there was no access to formula milk or human milk banks, that solidarity between mothers was absolutely vital and, from my point of view, really beautiful. So for me, it's a fascinating topic, and even more after knowing about milk kinship.
It actually completely makes you visualize the expression that they say it takes a village to raise a child. What did you find out about milk siblings in different cultures that made it interesting for you?
I didn't know about the milk kinship until I got this stage of my life. And talking to a friend, he told me that a few years ago he had watched a program in a Moroccan channel about a couple who had to cancel its wedding because they discovered that they were breastfed by the same woman. And I found it really interesting. And I decided to research a little bit about. So what I discovered that was absolutely new to me is that in Islam, two people who don't share any blood bond but who were breastfed by the same woman are considered siblings, and therefore their union in marriage is prohibited. The Quran, which is the holy book of Muslims, describes clearly that ban. It's haram. When I talked to some scholars in order to make the piece, I realized that breast milk in Islam is very important. Why? Evidently because of its nutritious quality for the baby. But there is something else, and that is an extremely complex debate among legal Muslim experts. One of the professors who I interviewed told me that what has been discussed in some of the literature is whether milk is a transformation of semen in the body once gestation has occurred. So he explained to me that there are authors who say that when milk is conceived as a transformation of semen, children breastfed by the same mother become siblings because they share the same germinating substance. That is the way he explained it to me. So that is one view. But another view to try to understand this ban is a potential relationship between breast milk and genetic material transmission. So by being breastfed by the same mother regularly, they potentially could share similar genetic material. But as I said before, it's a very complex debate, and also because there are different opinions among Muslim scholars about how many times a baby has to be breastfed to create the kinship.
That's very interesting. You know, I come from a culture where this kind of wet nursing is very common. I actually was breastfed by my mom's cousin because they really wanted me to be breastfed. I was breastfed for a little while by my mom's cousin who had a daughter the same age as me. And my paternal grandmother and my maternal grandfather, they are milk siblings.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and they were like brother and sister. And we have a word in Farsi, in Persian, called hamshire, which exactly means milk siblings. What do you know about wet nursing now? Is it still a common practice now that you've done research on it?
I mean, that is a very difficult question because in many cases it's something very private. I mean, that occurs between very close friends and relatives and families. It's something that is not registered or written somewhere. So it's really a personal decision in many cases. In the context of the milk kinship, I remember a scholar that I interviewed. He has knowledge about Morocco, and he told me that he knows cases of people over 40 years old who have milk siblings, but no less than that age, because it's a phenomenon, according to him, that has begun to disappear in the last 30 years. But maybe is happening in isolated communities, in rural areas, maybe in communities of low resources. And after most of societies, if not in all societies, the well-being of a baby is above anything. And as you mentioned, it's also a personal decision. Your mom wants you to be breastfed. So she decided to ask her cousins. It happened in a private context,
That's absolutely true. Do you know how would communities prevent milk siblings from falling in love with each other? Must have been a complicated thing to do.
In that case, it is important to distinguish two things. If we think of wet nurses as, women who in many cases were paid to take care of the kids, and that included breastfeeding them, we will realize that that was a tradition that, without going too far, we find, for instance, here in Europe in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. In Spain, for example, wet nurses worked for the royal family in the 19th century, and a special relation was established. They even talked about milk relative, but it was different from the Muslim perspective. That is one thing. And another thing is the milkingship according to Islam. So when members of the same Muslim community that as a gesture of solidarity or love or religious duty assume the responsibility to breastfeed a baby, just because their biological mother couldn't, or because they want to make their bond even stronger. In that case, I remember that an anthropologist who I talked to, she told me that she discovered about milkingship when she did some field work in rural communities in Algeria. And she told me that women who breastfed other children told her that they memorized them very well to avoid future relationships or even future marriages.
And can you tell us a little bit about wet nursing in Latin America? Is there a history and tradition of it in Latin America as well?
As it happened in Europe, in Latin America during colonial times, wealthy women hired wet nurses to breastfeed their children. In many cases, they were servants who lived and worked inside the homes. Even in the beginning of the 20th century, some women offered that kind of service to families. Something interesting that I read was that, for example, in Argentina, some women voluntarily breastfed babies in special places. And they do it during hours that the mothers weren't working. So nowadays, Latin America has an important network of human milk banks that include many countries. But we have to remember what I mentioned in the beginning about isolated communities and poor communities. And I don't have statistics and I don't have data, and I even don't know if it is possible to collect it. But what is so clear to me is that solidarity between women and between mothers persists over the time. And that is why I find this absolutely inspiring, and the Muslim concept of milkingship very powerful indeed.
Female solidarity and strong bonds with Margarita Rodriguez. This year, COVID-19 has dominated the news headlines, but it's also changed everything about how many of us work. So we took our remote mic to the floor to find out how it's been for some of our colleagues, starting with Beatriz de la Pava of BBC Minute's Spanish team.
I started working from home on the 11th of March. I remember the day as if it was yesterday because they sent me back home because my throat was a bit rusty. And that's when my whole pandemic experience started. Turns out I had coronavirus. I was very ill for 3 weeks, and at that time there was still a lot of confusion around what the symptoms were, how to deal with it. So I ended up not leaving my house for 38 days until all the symptoms were completely gone, because I didn't want to put anyone at risk, of course. And one of the days that I remember the most was when I finally came out of the flat. It was a lovely sunny day. I started walking, grabbed a bike, started pedaling. I remember when I arrived to the canal, my eyes were watery because that was the first time I felt the sun straight on my skin. So the sun and the fresh air is something I really, really cherish nowadays, more than ever.
I am Grigor Atanasian, a journalist with BBC News Russian. When we all went into the first lockdown back in spring, my wife Gina and I were happy that we finally had enough time to spend with our dog, Lola. She's a French bulldog, she's very playful. but we always felt a little bit guilty about not spending enough time with her because we would be busy, commuting to work, coming back exhausted. Finally we had time, but it turned out that Lola wasn't actually all play, that she enjoyed her afternoon naps, and after some times she would be really exhausted from all the attention she was suddenly getting from us, and from time to time we would find her hiding in some dark corner of the house, looking exhausted, and in her eyes you would read the silent plea, as if she wanted to say, "Could you please already just leave me alone?"
My name is Isaria Praitong-Yam. I'm the planning editor of the BBC Thai service. I have been working from home since the end of March 2020. Of course, working from home has changed my life quite a lot. I don't need to travel to work. I can sleep longer. I have better food to eat at lunch. And I have more time with my family in the evening. I actually have a funny story about my child to share. He was ill because of something else, not COVID-19. He missed school for the whole week. But on Friday, he wanted to go to school because he missed his friends so much. So he went. Then he came back home. His teacher sent an email saying that, "Oh, well, your child was in a Spanish class and a pupil in the class has COVID-19, so he needs to be self-isolated for 2 more weeks. So if he didn't go to school on that Friday, he wouldn't go to the Spanish class and he wouldn't need to be self-isolated." So I think my child now, he just wants to kick himself.
My name is Ibrat Safo and I work for the BBC Uzbek. When we started working from home, I usually like changes, when something new happens. So it was quite exciting. So I bought my own green studio at home. I installed these things. I got all the technical equipment. And I had this rush of energy that I was doing interviews. But my flat is a bit small. And I live on my own and I live with my dog. And my dog is a Jack Russell who is full of energy. And she thinks that when I start either presenting my program or explain a video or interviewing someone, she thinks it's a game. So in the middle of or at the start of an interview, she may just start sort of bothering me or shaking herself. I had a brilliant time throughout the summer, but by about September, I started getting this sort of depressive feeling, and I just wanted more human communication, more human touch. One of the reasons why I started getting quite depressed is that I started feeling this sort of bloated feeling that I'm not fit anymore because I live on a hill, and going up a hill, getting this short of breath, I just thought, this wasn't the case before when I was going to the gym. What I really miss is the gym. I have my weights at home, so I did some exercise at home. I also bought this special elastic band that you attach to the top of a door and then you work out. And the first day when I tried them, it ended up undoing itself and I had a massive injury on my forehead. So that was the downside of starting the new type of exercises. But it's not the same. I think in the gym, you look at each other. I have mates, I chat to them. It's a social thing. Whereas at home, you end up just working on the sofa, watching TV on the sofa, just lying on the sofa and falling asleep on the sofa.
My name is Mayuresh Konur. I am the Marathi service correspondent here in Mumbai. I've been reporter for 13 years now, and I have traveled everywhere, but I've never been a desk man. And ever since the corona pandemic started and the lockdown was declared in India, I was locked in the home. It was like prison. First 4 months, I was just editing the stories sitting inside the home. So whatever the lives, the Facebook lives or the rants or the interviews I was supposed to do using my iPhone, for that you need cameraman. So what can we do? Because the cameraman was not allowed to come to my place. So then I found a camera person in my wife. She was also stuck inside the home. So then I had to give her sort of a basic training, how to use our iPhone for shooting, how to use the lapel mic, how to make the connections. And then our terrace became our part-time studio. So she became my cameraman.
Perks and perils of working from home. Now, BBC Urdu's Umar Draz Nangiana has done a series about sites and monuments associated with women and found a story about an historic mosque and a temple in the city of Lahore dedicated to Moran Mai. She was a court dancer who captured the heart of Ranjit Singh, a Sikh ruler who extended his empire beyond the borders of Punjab in the 19th century and gave her the power of a queen. Umar takes up the story.
Lahore, is an historical city. The city has seen, rise and fall of many empires. There are a lot of buildings which are still standing today. Many of them are still not known to the people, even to the residents of Lahore. So I came across this mosque in one of very populated old Lahore areas. It was associated with a woman. This woman was Mora.
And can you tell us more about Mora? How did she get her own mosque and also a Hindu temple, if I'm not mistaken?
Mora was basically a nautch girl. She was a professional dancer and she was also a sex worker as well. So there was this red light area in Lahore back then, which is where her mosque is located today. When Ranjit Singh conquered Lahore, he was the first local Punjabi who ruled over Punjab ever. So when he established his rule in Punjab, he also came to know about Mora because she was very beautiful and there were stories about her beauty. And then Ranjit Singh wanted to meet her. We know that he came to this red light area and to the residence of Mora Mai. And they say that when he saw her for the first time, he fell in love with her. And then he would hold his royal court at her place. She never married, she never lived in the fort, which was the official residence of the Maharaja. She always lived in her place, and it was the Maharaja who would go to her place, and he would release official decrees from that place. Some of those decrees are preserved even today, and you can see those decrees, which have official stamps from Ranjit Singh, which say that this decree was officially released from the Kotha of Mora Mai. Kotha is this place where people used to go to see the dance performances, these dancing girls.
She was more than just a beauty. She had brains and she ruled as a queen, whereas she wasn't a queen.
She was very influential. People would come to her with their problems, and she, using her influence over Ranjit Singh, would get those problems resolved. So she was very popular back then. And there's this one anecdote. When Ranjit Singh was planning to conquer Lahore, he was facing resistance. So there were people from inside the Lahore fort who conspired against the Lahore rulers and they sided with Ranjit Singh. One of them opened the gates, and that's how Ranjit Singh managed to enter the city and then conquer it and then subsequently rule the entire Punjab region as well. So this person, Ranjit Singh, would regard him as his father. There was a special place reserved for him in the royal court. He was awarded with a lot of gifts and private property and everything. But at one point, this particular guy did not like the fact that the official court was being held at the residence of Mora Mai. So he first tried to, talk to Ranjit Singh. And when Ranjit Singh did not budge, he had a quarrel with Mora Mai. And he challenged her that he would send her back to her business. And Mora Mai, in return, challenged him that she would send him back to the marketplace where he would once again be selling onions. Yeah, and she won. She won in the end.
Oh, wow. Umar, when was this mosque built and how?
There's a very interesting story behind it. Ranjit Singh and Mora Mai, they spent time together at a minaret of one of the mosques in Lahore. It is called Wazir Khan Mosque. It is revered as a sacred place for Muslims and the Muslim community in general, and particularly the Muslim clerics declared them sinners, and there were fatwas, issues against them. So there was a huge hue and cry about it. Mora Mai also repented, and to compensate this, she decided to build this particular mosque, which is located right next to where her residence was. So you have to go to this particular area called Shah Alam Market, and this was the area where this red light area was established in Ranjit Singh's time. So you have to go to this very busy, populated old Lahore part, and you have to find your way through narrow alleys and streets, and then you get to the Papar Mandi market, and in there is this small mosque hidden. And there are minarets that are still in place, which you can see if you go there.
Moran Mai, quite an exceptional woman. Not only she had a mosque named after her, also a Hindu temple. What was the story behind that?
That's an interesting story as well. They say that Mora Mai's mother, she got ill, and they discovered that she was under the influence of spirits. So Mora Mai contacted one of the Hindu preachers who was heading a very small temple in some area. So this preacher agreed to treat her mother, but in return he wanted Mora Mai to build a huge temple for him, for the Hindu community in that area, to which Mora Mai agreed. Her mother got well, and then as she promised, she built this temple, which was a huge temple. The central part is still intact. The other buildings were destroyed during 1992 riots, which erupted after this episode where the Babri Mosque was demolished in Delhi in India. And in retaliation, they destroyed Hindu temples here in Pakistan, and this particular temple was one of them.
And how well known are these stories? How many people, for instance, know the story of this mosque and Mora Mai?
There are legends about it, because if you go to that area and you talk to the local people, they'll tell you different kinds of stories. But the younger generation, they don't know about her. They wouldn't even know that this mosque exists and what's the story behind it. And that's exactly when we did the story, it got a lot of traction. I mean, 500,000 people saw the video.
Do you think that strong female characters are catching the eye of younger audiences and they're probably looking for more female heroines and female role models these days?
I personally feel that it is also because more and more women or girls are now accessing the social media and media in general. So yes, younger generation in particular is very interested in such stories.
Umer Draznangiana from BBC Urdu and the story of Mora Mai. More from the fifth floor after this break.
This is the BBC World Service, revealing the Kenyan warriors who are now elephant caretakers.
We walk with them in the bush and we sleep with them in the night. That bond that we have is such strong. Sometimes they are not feeling well. You also feel like you are not okay.
This is a story about people and the animals they protect.
Be lost out of the peaceful travel.
Diverse tribes and ethnic groups all coming together.
তো আমরা আছি এই মুহূর্তে স্টার সিনেপ্লেক্সের সামনে বিশ্ব সুন্দরী দেখলাম ফার্স্ট ডে ফার্স্ট শো রিভিউ কালকে দেবো কালকে রাখা হবে তাহলে ফুল রিভিউ নিয়ে ওকে বাই
Hear how elephants became a catalyst for peace with me, Michael Kaloki.
All those elephants has brought us together.
Warrior Elephant Guardians, Tuesday at 9:20 GMT.
And still to come on the fifth floor today, a map that reveals some of Istanbul's secrets.
I didn't know that there were weasels living on the dome of historic mosque of Eminönü. Just next to the mosque, there is a spice bazaar and there's a food bazaar. That's why during Ottoman times, and they were sneaking to the bazaar in the night and stealing some food.
Weasels and other surprises with BBC Turkish after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Hundreds of Nigerian schoolboys who were abducted a week ago have arrived back in their home state, Katsina. They were taken by bus to a government building in the state capital, barefoot and bewildered. They're currently undergoing medical examinations. They were freed in neighbouring Zamfara state on Thursday. The circumstances remain unclear. A bomb explosion in central Afghanistan has killed at least 15 people, many of them children. The Afghan Interior Ministry said 20 other people were hurt in the blast in Ghazni province. Explosives hidden in a vehicle detonated close to a house where a Quranic recital ceremony was taking place. The former president of Burundi, Pierre Buyoya, has died in Paris after contracting the coronavirus. He was 71. Mr. Buyoya was recently sentenced in his absence to life in prison for the murder of his successor, Melchior Ndadaye. The UN has warned of a worsening humanitarian crisis in northern Mozambique. The Islamist insurgency has forced more than 400,000 people from their